The Duke of Cambridge never believed he was a heartless man. Heartlessness, in his mind, required malice. It required cruelty, vindictiveness, or spite. Garrick Thornwood felt none of those things toward his wife. What he gave her instead was far worse. He gave her calculated transactional efficiency. At 36, Garrick Thornwood, known in society as the Iron Duke, was one of the most powerful industrialists in England. His railway lines stretched across counties like iron veins. His wealth came not from inherited titles alone, but from steam, steel, and ruthless precision. Parliament listened when he presented proposals. Investors scrambled when he called. His reputation was built on one principle. Everything had its price, its purpose, its place. Yet none of that precision had prepared him for what happened at the Merchants' Guild Gala. He had married Lady Mildred Fairfax 18 months earlier. The match had been approved by everyone who mattered. Two respected families united, strategic wetlands acquired, railway routes secured. Mildred was well-bred, well-mannered, and came with the marshlands his Cambridge to Norwich line desperately needed. She was also observant, intelligent, and quietly capable, though Garrick had dismissed those details as irrelevant to the agreement. Their marriage was a contract, not a covenant. The gala was meant to celebrate the opening of his new railway station. Crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, the mechanical future on glorious display. Garrick stood with three fellow railway magnates near the terrace doors, brandy in hand, discussing the northern expansion. Brilliant acquisition, Thornwood, Lord Kennedy said, gesturing with his glass. Those wetlands were the missing piece for years. Strategic necessity, Garrick replied, checking his pocket watch. The route required it. And the wife? Another asked with a knowing smile. Necessary acquisition as well. Garrick gave a dry laugh, the kind reserved for business dinners. She's just a dowry to me. The land was the point. The marriage was simply the mechanism to secure it. The men chuckled. Business was business, after all. What Garrick didn't notice was the sudden hush behind him. The way the music seemed to thin. The way his colleagues' expressions shifted from amusement to discomfort. He turned. Mildred stood 3 feet away, holding 2 champagne flutes. She must have been bringing him one. Her face was perfectly composed. No tears, no rage, no trembling. Just stillness. For a moment, time suspended itself like a train between stations. Then she smiled. A smile that belonged in a portrait, beautiful and completely lifeless. "My lord," she said, her voice carrying the exact temperature of morning frost. "The dowry will be waiting in the carriage." She set both glasses on a nearby table with deliberate care, turned with perfect posture, and walked through the ballroom as if she were merely leaving for air. Every eye followed her exit. Garrick stood frozen, brandy in hand, suddenly aware that he had just committed an error. Not in his calculations, those were always correct, but in something he couldn't quite name, something that made his chest feel strangely hollow. By the time he thought to follow, she was gone. So was their private coach. He had to hire a hackney carriage in the rain. The Iron Duke, dripping and alone, paying a stranger to take him home. To understand what Garrick had lost, though he wouldn't realize it for weeks, one must understand what he was. Garrick Thornwood did not believe in chaos. Chaos was what happened when systems failed, when people became emotional, when discipline broke down. He had built his entire life as a bulwark against disorder. His morning routine never varied. Wake at 5:47. Wash with cold water, builds character. Dress in clothes laid out with military precision. Breakfast at 6:30, 1 egg, 2 pieces of toast, black coffee. Review railway schedules and financial reports until 8 a.m. Then begin the day's work. His study was a testament to control. Books arranged by subject, then alphabetically. Papers filed, never stacked. Pens aligned. Even the painting above his desk, a landscape his mother once loved, hung at an exact 90-degree angle, which he checked weekly with a level. He hated crooked things, unpredictable things, messy things. People, he had learned, were the messiest things of all. So he treated them like he treated his railways, as systems to be managed. Staff had clear instructions. Business associates had defined relationships. Everyone had a function. Everyone stayed in their lane. Mildred, when she first arrived at Cambridge House, had been the perfect component in his system. She managed the household with quiet competence. She appeared at social functions on schedule. She asked nothing of him beyond courtesy. She was, he thought with satisfaction, low maintenance. What he never acknowledged was that Mildred wasn't low maintenance. She was the maintenance. She was the one who noticed when his favorite breakfast blend was running low and ordered more before he noticed its absence. She was the one who quietly revised the staff schedules so his study was cleaned before he woke, never during his work hours. She was the one who memorized the names of every investor, every politician, every minor official he needed to impress, and ensured the house ran seamlessly when they visited. She was the oil in his gears, invisible and essential. And he had just called her a dowry in front of London's financial elite. The morning after the gala, Garrick woke at 5:47 as always. He went through his routine with mechanical efficiency, certain that by breakfast, this awkwardness would be resolved. Mildred was reasonable. She understood the nature of their arrangement. He entered the breakfast room at 6:30 precisely. Mildred was already there, reading the Times, a plate of untouched toast beside her. "Good morning," he said, sitting in his usual chair. "Good morning, Your Grace," she replied without looking up. Your Grace. Not Garrick. Not even my lord with the familiar softness she usually employed. He frowned slightly. "About last evening." "The railway contracts are in your study," she interrupted, still reading. "I had them organized by deadline. The meeting Kennedy is at 2. I've instructed the cook that you prefer light lunches before important negotiations." Her tone was perfect. Professional. Helpful. Utterly devoid of warmth. Mildred. "Also, I've had your belongings moved to the guest wing. The east-facing room, as you prefer morning light. I thought it best we maintain separate quarters going forward, given the nature of our arrangement." Now she looked up. Her eyes were clear, her expression pleasant and distant, like a well-trained hotel manager addressing a valued guest. "After all," she continued, "a dowry requires no marital intimacy. I should not wish to impose beyond my contractual obligations." Something cold settled in Garrick's stomach. "That's not, I didn't mean." "You were quite clear about what you meant, Your Grace." She folded the newspaper with crisp precision. "I simply wish to ensure our transaction remains efficient. Isn't that what you value most?" She stood, smoothed her skirts, and walked past him toward the door. He reached out, catching her hand. "Mildred, wait." She flinched. Actually flinched, as if his touch burned. Then she gently extracted her hand and said, with devastating politeness, "Please, Your Grace, let us keep this professional. As you said, I am merely an asset. And assets perform better when the boundaries are clear." She left him sitting alone in the breakfast room, his coffee growing cold, staring at the empty doorway. For the first time in 15 years, Garrick Thornwood's schedule had been disrupted, and he had no idea how to fix it. The week that followed moved with the sluggish quality of a fever dream. Garrick told himself it was temporary. Mildred would calm down, see reason, return to the quiet equilibrium they'd maintained for 18 months. By Wednesday, he realized he'd been catastrophically wrong. She hadn't moved out. That would have been scandalous, visible, something he could have addressed. Instead, she'd done something far more surgical. She'd removed herself while remaining physically present, like a ghost haunting her own life. The guest wing became his new residence. His clothes appeared there, perfectly pressed, hung with the same care as always. His shaving kit, his books, his correspondence, all transferred with silent efficiency. When he'd gone to their bedroom, his bedroom, technically, he found the door locked. Not dramatically, just locked, as one might lock a storage room. At meals, she sat across from him with flawless posture, speaking only when necessary. The railway schedule. The weather. Whether he'd require the carriage. Her voice carried the pleasant neutrality of a telegraph operator reading messages. On Thursday morning, he tried to bridge the chasm over breakfast. He reached across the table, intending to cover her hand with his own. A gesture of reconciliation, however awkward. She pulled back so quickly the teacup rattled in its saucer. "Please, Your Grace." Her voice was gentle, final. "Let us keep this professional. As you said, I am merely an asset. I think as an asset I'd function best when the boundaries are clear. The word asset landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward into silence. He opened his mouth, then closed it. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound hollow after what he'd said at the gala? She was right. He had reduced her to a transaction. And now she was simply honoring the terms he'd set. By the second week, Garrick's carefully ordered world began to fracture in ways he couldn't initially trace. Small things first. His morning coffee arrived lukewarm. His favorite breakfast blend ran out, replaced with something bitter and cheap. He mentioned it to the housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, who looked at him with barely concealed pity. Her ladyship used to manage the household orders, Your Grace. She hasn't been to the kitchens in days. Then the larger cracks appeared. His shirts came back from the laundry limp, the collars soft instead of crisp. When he complained to his valet, the man shifted uncomfortably. The Duchess used to oversee the starching, sir. She had a particular method. Without her instructions, the staff. He trailed off, helpless. Garrick stared at the wrinkled cravat in his hands. Mildred had been managing his wardrobe? He'd assumed the valet handled such things. The valet, apparently, had assumed Mildred handled them. The breaking point came on Tuesday morning. He arrived at his club to meet with 3 potential investors for the northern expansion. Men who traveled from Edinburgh specifically for this meeting. He waited for an hour before realizing they'd never received confirmation of the time and location. The meeting he'd been planning for months evaporated like steam. When he confronted his secretary, the man pulled out the unsorted correspondence from the past 10 days. Letters, invitations, contracts, all jumbled together in chaotic heaps. I've been overwhelmed, Your Grace. Her ladyship used to review these each morning before you woke. She'd separate the urgent items, draft responses to the social invitations, flag the financial documents. I thought you knew. Garrick hadn't known. He'd thought the house simply ran itself, the way well-designed machinery runs. He'd never looked beneath the surface to see who was oiling the gears. On Friday evening, desperation drove him to Bond Street. If he couldn't find the right words, perhaps he could find the right gift. The jeweler showed him a diamond necklace, something tasteful and expensive. The kind of thing women were supposed to want. He brought it home in a velvet box, rehearsing what he'd say. An apology of sorts. An acknowledgement. Mildred accepted the box with the same polite detachment she used for everything now. How thoughtful, Your Grace. I shall wear it this evening. They were hosting the Minister of Trade, a crucial connection for securing parliamentary support. Garrick needed this dinner to go perfectly. Mildred descended the stairs wearing the diamonds. They glittered at her throat, cold and beautiful. She looked stunning. She also looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Throughout the meal, Garrick attempted conversation. She responded in monosyllables, her attention fixed on her plate. But when the minister mentioned his concerns about the railway expansion, Mildred transformed. She set down her fork and leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharpening with genuine interest. The gradient issue through the Pennines, she asked. I believe the German engineers solved something similar using a switchback system. It adds distance but reduces the incline stress on the locomotives. The minister blinked, clearly surprised to find intelligence beneath the diamonds. Precisely. You're familiar with the Cologne project. I read the engineering journals, Mildred said simply. The solution seems applicable to the Manchester route, particularly if the Duke adjusts the southern approach by 3 degrees. For the next 40 minutes, Garrick sat in growing horror as his wife discussed load calculations, rail gauge standards, and fuel efficiency with more fluency than he'd managed in years of study. She knew the grades of every route he'd surveyed. She understood the political complications in Parliament better than his own advisers. The minister was enchanted. Lady Mildred, you should be advising the Railroad Commission. She smiled that portrait smile. I'm merely a Dowry, minister. But thank you. The words cut through the dinner like a knife through silk. The minister looked confused. Garrick felt sick. After their guest departed, Garrick found Mildred in the drawing room, removing the diamond necklace. You knew, he said quietly. All this time, you knew everything about the railways. I've lived in this house for 18 months, she replied, setting the jewels on a side table. I've read your journals, listened to your meetings, reviewed your contracts when you left them scattered across the study. Yes, Your Grace. I knew. Why didn't you say something? She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw something break behind her eyes. Not anger. Something worse. Resignation. You never asked. The following Tuesday, Mildred left the house at 2 in the afternoon. Not for shopping or social calls, but dressed in a simple day dress, carrying a leather satchel that looked well used. She didn't ask permission, didn't offer an explanation, simply instructed the driver and departed. Garrick found himself standing at the study window, watching the carriage disappear down the street, seized by the irrational urge to follow. He didn't. That would be absurd. She was entitled to her own pursuits. He'd never monitored her schedule before. Except he'd never needed to before. She'd always been exactly where he expected her to be. She returned at 6, smelling faintly of oil paint and turpentine. When he asked where she'd been, she said simply, a lecture at University College. On structural engineering. After that, she left 3 times a week. Sometimes more. University lectures. Art salons. The British Museum reading room. She kept a calendar now, marking her engagements with the same precision Garrick used for railway schedules. On Thursday, while searching for a misplaced contract in the drawing room, he found her sketchbook tucked between 2 volumes of poetry. He shouldn't have opened it. He knew that even as his fingers traced the leather cover. Inside were drawings that made his breath catch. Not delicate watercolors of flowers or landscapes. Technical drawings. Architectural renderings of bridges, precise and beautiful, with notes in the margins about load distribution and material stress. Page after page of them, some half-finished, others meticulously detailed. The Clifton Suspension Bridge. The Iron Bridge at Colebrookdale. And others he didn't recognize. Designs that existed only in her imagination. Graceful spans that seemed to float, their mathematical elegance translated into art. He stood there for 20 minutes, turning pages, feeling like an intruder in someone else's mind. This wasn't kindness or domestic competence. This was brilliance, carefully hidden, never shared. She had an entire inner world, and he'd never thought to ask about it. The following week, Garrick did something he'd never done in 18 months of marriage. He followed her. He told himself it was concern for her safety. A woman traveling alone to questionable parts of London. But he knew he was lying. The truth was darker, more desperate. He needed to understand who she was when she wasn't being his wife. The lecture hall at University College was shabby, filled with earnest young men in threadbare coats and a handful of women clustered in the back rows. Mildred sat near the front, her notebook open, completely absorbed as the professor discussed advancements in cantilever construction. Garrick watched from the doorway, hidden in shadow. After the lecture, students crowded around the professor's desk. Mildred hung back, then approached a young man examining blueprints spread across a side table. He was perhaps 25, poorly dressed but animated, gesturing excitedly at the drawings. Garrick couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see Mildred's face transform. She was laughing, actually laughing, her eyes bright with genuine delight. The young man pointed to something on the blueprint, and she leaned closer to see. He touched her arm lightly to guide her attention, his hand lingering a moment too long. Something hot and violent surged through Garrick's chest. He took 3 steps into the room before stopping himself, hands clenched at his sides. The young man wasn't handsome. His coat was patched at the elbows, his shoes worn through. He had nothing. No title, no wealth, no power. But he was looking at Mildred like she'd hung the stars, discussing bridge designs with the reverence most men reserved for poetry. Garrick watched them for another minute, something painful crystallizing in his mind. He wasn't jealous of the man's youth or appearance. He was jealous that this impoverished architect knew Mildred's thoughts, knew what made her laugh, knew she dreamed in angles and equations. While Garrick owned the legal papers that bound her to him but had never bothered to learn her mind. The strike began on a grey Monday morning in March. 200 workers walked off the Cambridge to Norwich line, refusing to return until safety improvements were made. 3 men had died in the past month, 1 crushed by machinery, 2 from scaffold collapses. Garrick's first instinct was force. He had contracts with these men. They'd agreed to terms. He summoned his foreman and began drafting a request to the magistrate for militia support. Mildred appeared in his study doorway without knocking. "You can't send soldiers against them. They're breaking their contracts," Garrick said, not looking up. "Disrupting operations. I have investors to answer to. They're dying." Her voice was flat. 3 men in 4 weeks, Garrick. They have families. Children. He flinched at the use of his given name. She hadn't called him that since the gala. Business carries risks. They knew that when they signed on. Did they? Or did they sign because they were starving and you offered wages? She crossed the room, placed both hands on his desk. "I'm going to talk to them." "Absolutely not. It wasn't a request. Mildred, there are 200 angry men at those yards. Some of them are armed. I forbid it." She smiled then, cold and terrible. "The dowry is property, Your Grace. And property cannot be hurt. Isn't that how these things work? I am going." She turned toward the door. "Mildred, stop." He stood, panic threading through his voice in a way he'd never heard before. "Please. You could be killed. Then you'd be free to find another woman with convenient land holdings," she said without turning around. "The carriage leaves in 10 minutes. Come if you wish. Or don't." The door closed behind her with a decisive click, leaving Garrick staring at the space she'd occupied, his carefully constructed world crumbling into dust. Garrick rode behind her carriage, his horses' hooves striking cobblestones in rhythm with his racing thoughts. He'd grabbed his coat and followed without thinking, without planning, driven by something that felt dangerously close to terror. The rail yards sprawled across the eastern edge of Cambridge, a maze of timber scaffolding and half-laid track. 200 men stood in loose clusters, some holding tools that could easily become weapons. The air smelled of coal smoke and anger. Mildred stepped from the carriage before it fully stopped. Garrick dismounted, reaching for her arm, but she was already walking toward the crowd. "Lady Mildred." One of the foremen recognized her, surprise flickering across his weathered face. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "Mr. Patterson," she said calmly. "I'm here to listen." The men parted slightly, uncertain. Garrick stayed 3 paces behind her, every muscle taut. He'd miscalculated badly. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a powder keg. For 10 minutes, Mildred listened as the workers explained the conditions. Faulty scaffolding. Inadequate safety equipment. 12-hour shifts without breaks. She asked questions, took notes, nodded. Her presence seemed to calm something in the crowd. Then someone threw a bottle. Garrick never saw who. The glass shattered against the carriage, and suddenly the careful piece shattered with it. Shouting erupted. More objects flew through the air. The crowd surged forward, no longer a group of men but a single, angry organism. Mildred didn't run. She moved toward a woman clutching a small boy, trying to shield them both as the chaos swelled around her. Garrick stopped thinking. He drove his horse directly into the crowd, scattering men, not caring about the railway or the contracts or his carefully maintained reputation. Only her. He had to reach her. He found her crouched over the child, her body curved protectively. A chunk of coal arced through the air toward her head. Garrick threw himself from the saddle, covering her completely with his own body. The impact caught him across the shoulders, then something heavier struck his temple. Pain exploded white and hot. He felt Mildred's hands on his face, heard her voice saying his name, and then the world tilted sideways into darkness. He woke in his own bed 3 hours later, head throbbing, shoulder screaming. Mildred sat in a chair beside him, her dress torn and dusty, a cut above her eyebrow she hadn't bothered to clean. "You're awake," she said. "Not warm, not cold, simply factual. The workers. Being tended to. The militia didn't come. I sent word to cancel your request." She dipped a cloth in water, wrung it out with mechanical precision. "You have a concussion. The doctor said you'll recover. And you." "I'm fine." But she wasn't. Her hands shook as she pressed the cloth to his forehead. Garrick caught her wrist gently, and this time she didn't pull away. "Why did you do that?" she asked quietly. "You could have been killed." "So could you. I'm just a dowry. Remember." The words hung between them, sharp and painful. Garrick closed his eyes, the throbbing in his head nothing compared to the ache in his chest. I built the railway to connect cities, he said, his voice rough with pain and something deeper. Miles and miles of track, linking London to Cambridge to Norwich. I thought I was creating something that mattered. But I cannot connect to the person sitting next to me. I don't know your favorite color. I don't know if you take sugar in your tea when no one's watching. I don't know what makes you laugh. He opened his eyes, met hers. I don't want the wetlands, Mildred. I want you to look at me again. The way you used to look at me before I ruined everything. She was crying, silent tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. You never looked back, she whispered. Not once in 18 months. I know, and I will regret that for the rest of my life. 2 weeks later, Garrick's solicitor arrived at Cambridge House with documents. Garrick signed them in his study, each stroke of the pen feeling like amputation. He found Mildred in the drawing room, reading. She looked up as he entered, weariness flickering across her face. I've dissolved our marriage contract, he said without preamble. The wetlands are yours again. Free and clear. The house is yours if you want it. Everything is yours. He placed the papers on the table beside her. You're free to leave. To go to your architect friend. To go anywhere. I'm not holding you hostage anymore. She stared at the documents, then at him. You're releasing me. I'm letting you go because I love you. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. And love means you get to choose. I robbed you of that before. I won't do it again. Mildred picked up the papers, read them slowly. Then, with deliberate care, she tore them in half. What are you? You finally learned the value of what you have, she said, setting the torn pages aside. Now, earn it. Mildred. Court me, Garrick. Properly. The way you should have done from the beginning. Take me to dinner. Ask me about my day. Learn who I am. She stood, crossed the room until she was inches away from him. Prove to me that you see me as more than landholdings and contracts. Prove that you can love the woman, not just regret losing the asset. He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. His fingers brushed her cheek, tentative, reverent. May I start over? He asked quietly. She considered him for a long moment, then offered her hand formally, as if they were strangers at a ball. Lady Mildred Fairfax. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. He took her hand, raised it to his lips, let himself smile for the first time in weeks. Garrick Thornwood. And the pleasure, Lady Mildred, is entirely mine. If you enjoyed this story of second chances and earned redemption, please subscribe to our channel for more emotionally powerful tales. Share this story with someone who believes in love that chooses to grow, not just love that happens by accident. Hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as it amazes us to know how far our stories travel. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.